Do you realize something? Let me tell you, if the health department of Greene County sees those videos that you put on the damn internet, they could condemn our house and we would have to move out of it.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be back.
Today we're doing something a little different.
Exactly.
We got a request from a listener to shine the spotlight on, well, someone you might not expect, Bob Chandler.
Interesting choice. Yeah, most people just know him as Chris Chan's dad, right?
Exactly. And look, we could easily spend this whole deep dive just on the, shall we say, interesting family dynamics there. But this listener, they wanted to go deeper, to understand Bob as an individual, not just a meme or a caricature.
I like it, getting past the surface level stuff.
Right. Because it's so easy to forget that Button had a whole life before Chris became internet famous. I mean, we're talking a career, military service.
Multiple marriages, other kids. The guy was busy. And this is all before the Chris Chan saga even begins. It's like people see that name and just stop digging.
Right.
But not us. We're going to do Bob justice.
Absolutely. And to kick things off, we got to talk about this. Bob Chandler, the engineer, for real, has multiple patents kind of engineer. Blew my mind when I saw that in the research.
Oh, yeah. The guy was no slouch when it came to that stuff.
It's so easy to skim over that word, though, right? Patents. Sounds boring, technical, but one of Bob's patents was for plastic molding machines. Think about that for a second. Every time you pick up a water bottle, there's a chance Bob's ingenuity played a role in that.
Wild, isn't it? That little connection makes you see the guy in a whole new light.
Totally. Suddenly, Bob's not just some name on a screen, he's part of our daily lives. But of course, we can't talk about Bob without addressing the elephant in the room, being Chris's dad.
Right, and that's where things get a bit more, let's say, nuanced.
It's tempting to fall into the easy narrative, right? Bob, the good parent, Barb, the bad one.
Oh, for sure. That's the common take you see online. And look, there might be some truth to that, but it's never that simple, is it?
Never. Especially when you factor in everything we know about how autism was viewed back then. This was the 80s, folks. Not exactly known for being progressive on neurodiversity.
And that's crucial to remember, because it colors everything about how Bob approached fatherhood. It's clear from the research that he loved Chris, but did he truly understand him? That's a whole other question.
And that's what we're going to unpack, right? Because we see these anecdotes of Bob trying to connect with Chris the Dreaming Studio, the whole stamp collecting thing. On the surface, seems wholesome enough, right? Typical dad stuff.
Right. But was that really what Chris needed? Or was it more about Bob projecting his own interests, trying to fix something that wasn't broken?
It's tough to say for sure, but it speaks to the complexities of parenting a neurodivergent child, especially during a time when those differences weren't acknowledged or understood like they are today.
And that's where things get, well, kind of heartbreaking. Because even with those efforts, it's clear from the sources that Bob, he just didn't get it. The autism, I mean. Some of his views, they were straight out of the 80s, you know?
Yeah, sadly that wasn't uncommon back then. Autism was so misunderstood, often seen as something shameful, something to be hidden. Which is just tragic when you think about the impact that had on Chris, growing up feeling like he was broken, like he needed to be fixed.
It's impossible to overstate how damaging that can be to a child's development. And the sources suggest Bob even fought against getting Chris professional help. Probably thought he could handle it on his own, that it was a parenting issue rather than, a neurological difference.
And that's the thing with Bob, right? He clearly loved Chris, wanted the best for him.
Yeah.
But what was the best in his mind? Was it about Chris's needs or about fitting him into some preconceived mold?
Exactly. And this is where the whole tough love approach comes in, which, look, can be effective in certain situations. But with a neurodivergent kid, it's a tightrope walk. One wrong step and you're doing more harm than good.
And boy, does it seem like Bob took a few wrong steps. We see it in those stories about the mock job interviews, the chaperone dates. I mean, can you imagine, knowing Chris, those must have been social car crashes waiting to happen.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, for someone like Chris, who already struggled with social cues and anxiety, those situations would have been completely overwhelming. It's like throwing someone who can't swim into the deep end and expecting them to just figure it out.
And eventually it seems like Bob just gave up. Like he reached a point where he felt like nothing was working, so why even try?
And this is where it gets really complicated, because the sources indicate that Bob actually encouraged Chris not to work, like actively steered him towards relying on benefits instead of trying to make a living.
Wait, seriously, he discouraged his own son from being independent.
It seems that way. And look, I'm not saying it came from a bad place. Bob probably thought he was protecting Chris, shielding him from a world that clearly overwhelmed him. But the long-term consequences of that decision, well, we see them playing out in Chris's life, don't we?
It's that classic road to hell paved with good intentions scenario, isn't it? Bob thought he was doing what was best, but ultimately, it might have done more harm than good. And it adds this whole other layer to the question of Bob as a father. Yeah, he was present, but was that enough?
Right. And it gets even more complex when we factor in Bob's declining health in those later years.
Yeah.
The heart attacks, the bizarre incident with the bug bites, it clearly took a toll on him, on the entire household.
Speaking of which, that bug bite thing. Just wild. The guy's in quarantine, covered head to toe in bites. I mean, it just speaks to the state of things at the Chandler home, you know?
Definitely not the most stable environment, to put it mildly. But the point is, Bob's final years were rough. And when he passed away in 2011, the reaction online was surprisingly respectful.
Yeah.
Even from people who'd been critical of him in the past. There was this understanding that a human life had been lost, a son had lost his father, and that deserved some basic decency.
Yeah, for a brief moment, the online drama took a backseat to actual human emotion. But of course, this being the Chris Chan saga, things didn't stay that way for long. Chris, being Chris, started to rewrite history, shall we say.
Yeah, about that. Chris's evolving relationship with the truth, especially when it comes to his dad, that's a whole other can of worms.
It's like, death is a tough concept to grasp, right? Even for, neurotypical folks. So for Chris, with his whole different way of processing the world, it's almost like he couldn't accept it, so he had to invent a new reality where Bob wasn't really gone.
It's sad, in a way. And it speaks to just how deeply Chris's worldview has been shaped by the online world. Remember, this is a guy who'd spent years crafting elaborate fantasies, blurring the line between reality and fiction. So when faced with a loss as profound as his father's death, well, he fell back on what he knew, reshaping reality to fit his narratives.
And he did that in a couple of interesting ways. First, there was the whole blaming trolls thing. Like, the stress of dealing with online harassment literally killed Bob, which, come on, we all know that's not how it works.
Right, but in Chris's mind, it made sense. It fit into this persecution complex he'd been building for years. The trolls weren't just being mean, they were lethal. It's a classic example of how Chris externalized blame, refusing to acknowledge any personal responsibility for the negativity in his life. And then, as if that wasn't out there enough, we get to Robert Chu. Which, I gotta be honest, even after all this research, my brain still kind of short-circuits trying to wrap itself around that one.
Oh yeah, that's peak Chris Chan lore right there. Buckle up, folks.
So, Chris, influenced by some of his online handlers, had this whole thing about multiple dimensions. And in his mind, Bob didn't just die, he ascended, became Robert Chu, this Sonichu-like being, living it up in some other dimension, complete with, like, lightning powers and whatnot.
So, to recap, beloved father passes away, becomes bizarre Pokemon creature ruling over another dimension. Just another day in the Chris Chan saga, I guess.
Pretty much. And look, it's easy to laugh, to dismiss it as just another example of Chris being Chris. But there's a tragic element to it too, don't you think? This inability to cope with loss in a healthy way, so he creates these elaborate fantasies instead.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, with all the narrative rewriting, all the fantasy layers, how much of Chris's actual relationship with Bob, the real human Bob, shines through? Or is it all filtered through this distorted lens he sees the world through?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's a satisfying answer. We can analyze the sources, try to separate fact from fiction, but ultimately we're left with more questions than answers, which in a way is fitting for the Chris Chan saga, wouldn't you say?
100%. But even with all the strangeness, the twists and turns, I keep coming back to Bob. What's his legacy? What impact did he have, not just on Chris, but on the world around him? It's a question worth pondering, even if the answers are messy and complicated.
Absolutely. Because on the one hand, you have this talented engineer, a guy who built a career, had a family, contributed to society. That side of him shouldn't be forgotten. But at the same time, it's hard not to see Bob's story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that good intentions aren't enough, that sometimes even the people who love us the most can make choices that hurt us deeply, especially when they don't understand, when they lack the knowledge or the awareness to truly support us in the ways we need.
And that's the thing that sticks with me, I think. The importance of empathy, of seeking out information, of challenging our own assumptions about what's best for others. It's a lesson that transcends the Chris Chan saga. It's something we can all take to heart. Because none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. But it's the effort, the willingness to learn and grow that really matters.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And sometimes those lessons come from the most unexpected places. Who knew we'd be unpacking all this from a deep dive into Bob Chandler, right?
Right. It just goes to show every life, no matter how seemingly ordinary, has layers upon layers of complexity. And sometimes it's by peeling back those layers, by asking the tough questions, that we uncover the most profound truths, both about ourselves and the world around us. So to everyone listening, keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and keep an open mind. You never know what you might discover. And for now, that's a wrap on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another journey in...
I'm working on it!
Go do it.